Hello, and welcome to Inquirer Live, the Will Bunch conversation. I am, as you might have guessed, Will Bunch. I'm the national opinion columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'm also somebody who lives for presidential campaigns and times like this. This is actually the 10th presidential campaign that I've covered, going all the way back to 1984 when I was 25 years old and chasing Jesse Jackson all over Alabama for Super Tuesday. So I have a lot of experience, and I have to say, I've never covered a presidential race like this one. So I'm so glad that so many of you signed up for this and are here. This is my second Inquirer Live that I've done, and I'm both more excited and a little bit more nervous than I was the first time around. But I'm really glad because I have two incredible guests who are going to help me work through this topic that's so timely. And I think it's a topic that's probably keeping a few of you awake at night. I know it is for me and people in my household, so it probably is for you too. And the question is, how can America survive the days after the 2020 election? And that's not normally the kind of conversation we'd be having 4 or 5 days before a presidential election, right? Usually we're talking about who's going to win, and we're still talking about that. But there's never been a year like 2020, and there's never been a president like Donald Trump. He's made it clear that he's going to claim widespread fraud, and that he's almost certainly going to challenge the vote counting process and the results. The things that are people keeping up at night include, will there be voter intimidation and even violence on election day and in the days that follow? Will Trump and the Republican Party try and halt the vote count? Will the courts that are now packed with judges appointed by Trump and by Mitch McConnell go along with what they're doing? What should we do if Trump appears to have lost the election, but he refuses to concede? Or if state lawmakers try and disregard the results and install Trump supporters in the Electoral College? And here's something else of great importance. How can the news media cover this in a way that's responsible and good for protecting American democracy? Like I said, I've got two incredible guests to answer my questions and, more importantly, your questions. Brandon Evans is a political operative who's worked behind the scenes over the last few years to bring progressive change to Philadelphia and beyond. He was campaign manager in 2017 for the revolutionary election of Larry Krasner as the city's reform-minded district attorney, and he played a similar role 2 years later for the re-election of Mayor Kenny. He's currently national political director for Real Justice PAC, which works to elect progressive prosecutors across the United States. This fall, he worked with two other progressive activists to produce a 40-page guide called The Count, which aims to show both Democratic leaders and everyday folks like us how to survive and how Democrats can win a contested election this fall. It's a great read, and it's got a lot of information about dates and timetables and how a contested election might play out. And what you can do about it as a citizen. So you should definitely read it. The place you can find it is at thecountguide.com. That's where you can read it, and you should read it between now and Tuesday. I strongly recommend it. And Brandon, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Will.
Good. And I'm going to introduce our second guest, who I'm also very excited to have. That's Margaret Sullivan. And Margaret's a familiar face to anyone who follows American journalism. At her hometown, Buffalo News, she rose from intern, if I'm not mistaken, but definitely local reporter, to become the top editor at one of America's great newspapers. And she remains a fierce advocate for the power of local journalism. She then became the public editor of the New York Times, where she constantly prodded editors and reporters at the nation's most influential newspaper to do a better job. Occasionally they did. And when her stint there ended, she became media columnist for the Washington Post, which is her current position. This summer, she published a book. It's called Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy. And it's really a great book. It's about the importance of saving local news. And I can't more strongly urge people watching this to go out and get Margaret's book called Ghosting the News. It's really excellent. At the start of the fall campaign season this year, Margaret wrote a column for the Post that was called, "Here's What the Media Must Do to Fend Off an Election Night Disaster." And that's why I'm so glad she's here to talk about that today. Before we get into, I have a couple of questions, and we'll start taking your questions soon. I just wanted to real quickly throw in, just for 1 minute, my own 2 cents on the subject, which is, I think we all agree that the next month could be the most fraught time for America and for our system of government since the Civil War, which is really saying something. This week, the New York Times published an article about President Trump's strategy for winning in Pennsylvania, which could be the state, our state, which decides the entire election. But I mean, what was shocking to me was the piece wasn't really about how Trump was going to persuade young people or Hispanics or senior citizens or any other group that he'd be a better president than Joe Biden. No, the piece was all about voter suppression. It was about sending people to polling places to possibly intimidate voters, about using efforts to discredit and then halt the counting of mail-in ballots, and possibly using their Republican majority in Harrisburg or some of the friendly judges that they've appointed, up to and including the Supreme Court now, to make that scheme work. I find that unconscionable. With all the issues facing America, like the coronavirus, the economy, the issue that really matters in the coming week is whether the United States can remain a democracy, and what we, our leaders, our journalists, like me and Margaret, and everyday citizens, what can we do to preserve it? Margaret, I wanted to ask you the first question. You've urged the major news media to help the public understand the issues, to make it clear that it's unlikely a winner can be called on election night, to not call the race too early, to have a transparent method for eventually declaring the winner. I'm curious what you've seen so far since you wrote that column, and do you have any sense from what you've seen that they're really prepared for the election night and the aftermath that we're expecting?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Will, for having me, and hi to Brendan and to all of your viewers, I guess we call them, listeners and viewers. Well, I am actually, I think it's going to be a very challenging few days and maybe longer. I really do. But I am somewhat encouraged by what I've seen in the news media, both on broadcast news, which I watch dutifully, I guess I'll say, and cable news, same there. And also what I've seen in the mainstream, printed or text press that we don't really see in print necessarily, but mostly on our phones. I think the journalists are pretty aware of what the dangers are. And there have been all of these sessions, whether it's, the Shorenstein Center or the Aspen Institute or PEN America, that have done these gatherings of journalists and election officials and political officials to kind of, work through some of this stuff. So I think there actually is a high level of awareness that among journalists, that this is not like other elections, presidential elections or others that they've covered, and that it requires some unusual, an unusual amount of context, an unusual amount of explanation, a lot of patience. I mean, these are all things we're not actually all that good at as journalists. I mean, we don't really specialize in patience too much, but I think there is an understanding that that's called for. Now, it hasn't happened yet. And so then you get to election day and election night, and a lot of Americans go, oh yeah, oh right, presidential election, I think I'll turn on CNN. And at that point, it's like they want to know the answer to the question of who's the president going to be. And there may very well be no answer. And so that, I think, is sort of where the problem comes. So that's like just a sort of a start.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think the journalists kind of understand the stakes to some degree, but I guess the real worry is the public, especially in this day and age, because you have a president who's going to go on Twitter and is going to bypass the gatekeepers, right, and possibly try and proclaim victory. And I guess that'll be the challenge for how the media can deal with that scenario, which very could likely play out, right?
Right.
Yeah. So Brandon, thanks again for joining us. I was hoping you could tell the audience just why you and your co-authors, Zach Malitz and Becky Bond, are the two authors you work with, why you decided to write the count. I mean, obviously, there was this sense that there was something different about the 2020 election. What's really the main thing you want the public to know about the vote counting? And also, I was wondering, maybe you could touch on something you touched on in your report, which is, I know you and your co-authors felt the Democratic Party made a lot of mistakes in 2000 when there was also a contested election in terms of the way they handled it. And I was wondering if maybe you could touch on that, and maybe what the Democrats could learn from those mistakes 20 years ago.
Sure. Thank you for having me again, Will. I would say, it's, first of all, I want to just lay this out very briefly. Me and my colleagues, as Becky Bond and Zach Mallitz, we're political strategists and campaigners. One of the reasons that we put this together was to just be very clear that, this thing may very well is going to boil down to narrative and message, right? Something we know very well from campaigns. Mm-hmm. So it's not about, the legal scholars were, come on like shows like this and on CNN, and they will pontificate, and they will talk about if, then, and what we saw. And the reason we wrote this was you had a president behaving like an autocrat, talking about, well, there won't have to be a transition if you just get rid of the ballots. And so part of, I think, the greatest thing that we would want the American public and any of the readers of the Count Guide to walk away with is to be prepared to act, be prepared to be, to insist that every vote is counted, that every ballot is counted, to challenge the behavior of Trump and the Republican Party, who has shown that they have no regard for institutions or the good faith that regular everyday people place in institutions. And I want to make that point. I think so much of what our process is based on good faith in American institutions, and things like the peaceful transition of power, are almost like things that we actually don't think about. And so what is at stake in this election is not necessarily who won, Democrat or Republican. That's, we do that all the time. Local elections, federal elections on the federal level, that's about candidates. This is not about candidates. This is about someone trying to literally undermine the democracy and steal in the election. The president, in the lead up to this election, has begun to plant the seeds of disinformation, of, the validity of the mail-in system, right? And so I think we were paying attention to that when this was written. And so I think, some of the lessons, learned into 2000 primarily was, Al Gore had faith in the system, right? That this would go into the courts, and that while the Republicans had a sharp, PR machine talking about sore loser and those things like that, right? You didn't have that on the Democratic side. We didn't activate activists and have people in the street, and we didn't have a sharp message. It was unclear. It was about, letting things play out. It was about, and or if there's a winner. It was about those things. So I just think, I think narrative here is going to be critically important from both, Democrats and what they are relaying to the general public. And for the sake of democracy, I think people are going to have to be prepared to say, no, actually, we want, no matter how long it takes, to have every vote counted so that we can determine the winner.
Yeah, I think the way you guys put it in your report, which I thought was good, was that the Republicans fight a guerrilla war when these type of things happen, and at least in 2000, the Democrats, took a very legalistic approach, and and you had Republicans doing. I don't know if you mentioned, like in 2000, the Republicans had the famous Brooks Brothers riot, right, where you had people at the poll, and no one's advocating anybody should riot, but it does show, I think, that having an engaged, involved public, you're right, writes a narrative, kind of sways opinion. Somebody in the audience just wanted me to repeat. I'll repeat it again. The report that Brandon co-authored, The Count, is at thecountguide.com. If you want to read it, somebody wanted to know that. We're starting to get a couple questions. I'm gonna go to a couple of them. One from Renee is, are there any laws requiring the peaceful transfer of power? Or are there only, quote, norms, unquote, that presidents just have followed in the past? And, what can regular citizens do to ensure this happens? You guys have some thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't know that it's ever, the norms have generally sort of taken care of it to a large extent. I don't think we've ever had, I mean, I may be wrong. I'm not a, an American historian, but I can't think of a situation in which the clear loser refused to leave power. But I think that we haven't had a president like Donald Trump before, and he's laid a lot of groundwork for, as you've said at the beginning, Will, for contesting everything, basically not believing or encouraging people not to believe anything unless it's a victory for Donald Trump. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be interesting if there is a very strong election day showing for Biden, let's just say, that could be one thing. If it's really close, or if, as a lot of people are forecasting, if there's a sort of a red mirage in certain states in which the early or the votes that come in because people have gone to the polls show a pro-Trump sort of bent, and then when the mail-in votes, of which we know there have been so many, start to get counted, they tend to favor the Democrats because more Democrats have voted that way. So this sort of business of, is there a blue mirage, is there a red mirage, that's something that we have a couple things going on that we've never had before. One is we're in the middle of a pandemic, and the other, and it's not unrelated, is that we have Donald Trump in the White House. So this is a very peculiar situation, and I don't know that that the norms of the past are definitely going to carry us through. I don't know the answer to the question of what the law is on transfer of power.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a couple sentences in the Constitution, that the new, that after it was amended, that the new president is sworn in on January 20th. And, having covered those 10 presidential elections, I can tell you in the first 9, no one even would have thought to ask this. I mean, the tradition I'm familiar with and grew up with and have covered my whole life has been the tradition of, George H.W. Bush writing this wonderful letter to Bill Clinton, when he left office, about the job and the responsibilities and how you'll grow into it. And we've all seen the pictures of, Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy riding in the car to the inauguration together. And that's the America we've come to expect. And the fact that, I don't think anybody, even if Trump loses and even if he concedes at some point and acknowledges defeat, most people don't even think he's going to show up to the inauguration, right? I mean, that's the kind of level we're functioning at now. So it's really quite a shock, and it really is a time that makes you kind of rethink everything, doesn't it?
Yes, Will. So much of this is norms and traditions, right? So like, and I think that's what makes it's so hard for most people to lean in and go, well, how can that happen? Aren't there rules around these things? Right. And I think that is where it's going to happen potentially, right? You'll get legal challenges. One of the most straightforward things to do for Donald Trump to do, again, as I think it's been said a couple of times on the show, is to just find every legal maneuver possible to stop the counting of the ballots, right?
Right.
So that's just one straightforward and direct way. But I think to the point you were just making, Will, I think what it draws into light is our actual system, right? And the foundations that it's actually built on, like to even think about, I believe you said those 10 that you covered, right? That there wouldn't be a transition, it was never a discussion.
Yeah, and the laws, there are very few laws about our federal elections, and the ones that are on the books are mostly like from the 19th century, and they're very vague. And it'll be interesting to see if there's any concerted effort after the dust settles from all of this, if and when it ever does settle, if there's any effort to rewrite those laws or fix this. Hey, before we go any further, there was one thing, and I apologize. I was supposed to do this at the beginning, and I'm going to do it now, which is just a little bit of housekeeping I was supposed to explain about how the questions work here. Because basically, you can submit your questions at any time during the discussion. The way you do that is you type your questions into the comment feature below on the page that you're on. And if you're watching this on social media, you can submit your questions on inquirer.com/bunchlive, BUNCHLIVE, bunchlive. And if time allows, we'll try and do as many questions as we can. We've already answered a couple during the Q&A session. Only questions submitted on inquirer.com are going to be answered during the discussion. And we have, despite me leaving that out, we've still gotten a few questions. Yeah, this actually, here's a question which actually was also on my list, so I'll ask it. It's from Erica, which is, have the big networks made their plans clear? What should they be doing on election night before to help viewers understand what's happening? I know you answered that a little bit in your first question. I would just add, the one thing I would add to that is, I wrote a column, I think back in September, saying that maybe the network chiefs and the editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post, et cetera, should have a summit meeting, that they should get together in a very high profile fashion. And with the goal being, here's our plan for how we're going to declare a winner. Here's our system. Here's what if there's not a winner after one night or two nights or three nights, here's how we're going to handle it. Issue a communique. Of course, they've done nothing like that. And, there is, of course, a countervailing argument that in the free press system that we have, that news organizations are supposed to compete and not cooperate, right? So that said, what are your thoughts on those things, Margaret?
Yeah, well, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any huge announcement by any of the networks, okay, everybody, this is what we're doing and it's different. But I have seen some stories about it. And it does seem that the networks, the cable networks, the broadcast networks have beefed up their reporting strength and their decision desk strength. So they have these, these groups of people who are veteran election journalists, and they are the ones who say, yes, for example, and this is not a network, but the Associated Press, the AP, always plays it very cautiously, and they intend to do that again. They have an important role in saying, yes, this particular state appears to have gone here. They have said that they are not making any, and they don't do this, they're not projecting winners. They are calling states when there's no possibility any longer that no matter, how many more votes come in, it can't overcome what's already been counted. So I think that they have communicated, at least in articles or in interviews, that they're going to take a particularly cautious approach. And to your point about should they have all gotten together, I mean, that has some appeal, and there is at least one important consortium of news organizations that do function that way. But as you said, these news organizations, including the one I work for, pride themselves on their independence. And so, that kind of runs against this business of we're all in it together. And, especially when the Fox Newses of the world and the Trumps of the world would like to paint everybody with the same brush. Oh, they're all in bed together. If, that is something that would argue against doing that.
Yeah. A question just came in, which actually was also on my list of questions. So I'm going to go to that one next. And it's directed mainly to you, Brandon, which is, do you think that the planned peaceful rallies by concerned citizens, the questioner says November 5th. I think I've actually seen suggestions of some as early as November 4th. But I guess the broader question is, there's been a lot of talk about, look, nobody expects Trump to concede. And if he's losing the election, we're going to have protests public protests. We're going to march, go to City Hall, whatever, on November 4th, November 5th, have large kind of pro-democracy protests to try and get Trump to concede. I mean, I was wondering, Brandon, first of all, what you know about those efforts, and B, I know in the count, you make the argument that public shows like that are helpful and important for the Democrats if they find themselves in that situation. So could you talk about the role of protests? Because obviously there's some fear, right, that there's some fear that it would provoke some kind of reaction from Trump, that he could send in troops or Homeland Security or something like that. I guess that's the concern about that, or that it would look like the Democrats are endorsing mob rule, is something I'm sure Republicans would probably say in response to that. So talk about the role of protests. How do you feel?
I think the role of peaceful protests are very important. To the previous conversation that we were having, about what the media covers, right? I think that's going to be important, to have large groups of people saying, no, actually, we don't want the ballot count to stop. I want my vote counted. Given to Margaret's point, what projections look like, people need to be in the street saying, no, absolutely. By every stretch of the imagination, it appears that Joe Biden won, right? Again, affirmative messages. And giving the media something to cover, I think, is absolutely going to be necessary, for people. We can't control what Donald Trump does, right? The one thing that the Republicans and Trump are good are staying on message, right? Or, according to Donald Trump, Democrats already endorsed, mob rule. He's called Joe Biden every name in the book, right? So I don't think we can worry about that or worry about his actions. And so if peaceful protesters calling for the transfer of power, calling for their votes to be counted and for their voices to be heard, invokes a response like potentially sending in federal agents or troops, I think we would all actually have our answer there, right? That he will be, this is more autocratic behavior. So, but I think these things will absolutely be necessary.
Yeah.
So I'd like to just add something to that, which is that I think that a message that should be repeated, whether it's by citizens or by the media or whoever, and I don't find it to be a partisan message, is that, it's so obvious to me, is that your vote should count. Every ballot should count. That if you voted by mail, it should count. If you voted in person, it should count. This is a small d democratic message that needs to be repeated just as much as the, kind of crazy messages that are repeated and magnified and held to the media's megaphone that we've seen happen so much in the Trump era. That's a simple and I think really important message that's going to resonate with people. We've seen these lines of 8-10 hours. It's insane. And while, as people have observed, while those lines are a great showing of how much people care about their role in the democracy, it's also, there's something very, very wrong about the fact that they are waiting that long. So, but I think that message of your vote should count and be patient while that actually happens. Some of these court cases that have come in various states say that, run against that. They say unless the ballot has arrived on election day, it's not going to count. And that came in pretty darn late. So I think there's a countervailing message is my point.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think for 20 years there's been a conversation about why does the Republican Party seem to want to make it harder for people to vote? So we had a big debate 10 years ago about voter ID laws, for example, and it's a little bit more of an abstract topic in that certain groups, people of color, young people are kind of hurt by voter ID laws. We've seen ever since the Voting Rights Act was essentially gutted by the Supreme Court, we've seen polling places in the South shut down. We've seen polling places on college campuses shut down because, heaven forbid, 19 and 20-year-olds, go out and vote, which has been appalling. But But we've never seen anything like what we're seeing this year, when they're actually just talking about, not counting ballots that came in through the mail. These states have procedures on the books, and they've been doing it this way in many cases for a number of election cycles, where you have to postmark. Your vote has to be postmarked by election day. If it comes in 2 days later, we count it because all the votes should count. And the fact that we're having this conversation, and the fact that several courts now, with judges who've been appointed by Trump and Mitch McConnell, are actually okaying this to shut down vote counting is really, really disturbing. And to get back to the original point, why wouldn't people be out in the streets protesting something like that? Because it just seems to be so un-American. One thing I want to ask, because it seems to be on a lot of people's minds, and I think understandably so, is I've gotten a couple questions over here about the Supreme Court. We had a situation where President Trump was very open about that he wanted Amy Coney Barrett seated on the Supreme Court because she might have to decide on an election dispute. A couple of the questions I'm getting is, is there really a role for the Supreme Court in our presidential elections? Is this something that we're
There was once before, if you recall correctly.
Yeah, I do recall.
There can be. These are generally state laws, but they can, if they get to a certain level, as the Florida situation did in 2000, in which there were there were state court rulings, and finally it went to the Supreme Court, and they made a ruling, and George Bush, therefore became president. Although, recounts would suggest he probably would have anyway, but that's sort of off the point. But yeah, I could see something over a period of time getting to the Supreme Court, and then that's very problematic because the court now has a justice on it. It has a couple of questionable justices on it. One who should be Merrick Garland, arguably, and one who was appointed, in the last few days.
While people were voting, while voting was already underway. Well, one of the viewers asked the question, should Amy Coney Barrett recuse herself if the election?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I think that's like one of those Oscar questions. Should win, will win. Should she recuse herself? I would agree with you, Margaret, and say absolutely. Will she recuse herself? I really.
I also see the questioner saying, can she be forced to recuse herself? And I don't think so. I guess Chief Justice Roberts could lean on her to recuse herself, but I don't think that can be forced. And I don't know if he would do that.
Yeah. Brandon, you were going to make a point.
No, I think Margaret was touching on a particular point about state law that, Congress would ultimately count the electors. What could happen is what happened in 2000. The judges didn't decide. The Supreme Court didn't decide the election. They decided the Florida recount, just to make that
that's right.
Make that distinction. That's all.
Yeah. We have a questioner about. I think there's a lot of anxiety about these mail-in ballots, right? In terms of how many are out there. Do we know how many have been received? One of the viewers wants to know. So by election night, if the uncounted, not yet received ballots are fewer than the numbers needed for the end of the night winner to be disposed, can the election be called? I think based on what you said, Margaret, and I actually didn't know this before today, but apparently they won't be calling a race if it can be decided by ballots that haven't been counted or mailed in yet, right?
Yeah, that's something I've read. I haven't done research on it, and I wouldn't take it to the bank. So I'll recuse myself on it.
We won't force you to recuse yourself.
No, right. But I think we've seen this happen in the past where, for example, elections have been called when the West Coast polls haven't even closed yet. So, this is something that we've run up against before. There can be an overwhelming situation in which it's obvious which way it's going.
Yeah, I think they changed some of that after 1980, because in 1980 I was a college student when Ronald Reagan was getting elected. I remember myself and another political science major went out and got a couple 6-pack of beers, and we had barely cracked open the first one when they declared Reagan the winner. We were throwing our beer cans at the TV set. We were like so mad, you know. But I think that and people on the West Coast complained because they hadn't voted yet, and I think they try and be a little bit better, but as we know from 2000 and some of these other cycles, and the networks don't always do what they promise they're going to do. So here's a question about an issue that I've been thinking about a lot, especially because I'm here in Philadelphia, so it's Brandon. But you know, we're seeing this unrest in the streets of Philadelphia over the shooting of another black man by the police, and so people are talking a lot about law enforcement, but also about law enforcement and their role in this election. One of the viewers wants to know: do you see the irony of law enforcement getting behind Trump? According to Trump, well, they are behind. A lot of them are behind Trump. About them having to quell any violence that will occur when Trump releases vigilantes and tells his people to get out in the streets. Will there be violence even if there is a landslide for Biden? How concerned are we about law enforcement given these groups like the National FOP, which are and the Border Patrol Union and some of these other groups have endorsed Trump for president? How problematic is their role in any unrest going to be?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that's a good question, Will. I think, look, we're here in Philadelphia, and I think, the district attorney here, and the mayor here have been very clear about their position on, people agitating and advocating, violence and the role that they're willing to take into ensuring the safety of citizens, and that citizens are able to vote. Like all things in these turbulent times, I feel like that's fluid. I mean, is there a possibility for violence? I mean, sure, you have Trump telling, people to go and act as poll watchers. So, who knows what could possibly happen given what has just happened in, again, using Philadelphia, for example, where there was just a very tense situation, and what will people try to do on election day or after? I don't think we'll know.
One thing I've been thinking about a lot the last day or two is you're probably aware, they've actually called out the National Guard in Philadelphia. They haven't gotten here yet. I think they're arriving today or tomorrow, which means we probably would have National Guard troops in Philadelphia during the election. To me, that bothers me, because especially if you've got troops, if you're on the way to vote and there's troops out patrolling the streets, is that potentially a form of suppression? I mean, does that intimidate voters if there's too much military law enforcement force out for something like an election?
Does it? I think everything, who knows if it could possibly intimidate voters. I think as long as there probably needs to be there'll probably be a noticeable presence. But from what I know, I don't think that they will be restricting the actual movements of voters, right? And
hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that will be important, as long as it's the National Guard being on notice is not in any way inhibiting or impugning on the agency of voters to actually get to the polls, do what they need to do, move around the streets, and do those things.
Yeah, hopefully the other unrest will calm down by then. Here's a question, and it's kind of touches on your book, Margaret, which is thoughts on what the disappearance of local news, which is the subject of your book, how could that make voter suppression easier? Maybe if not this election, in future elections. How important is we talk so much about the national news, right, and their responsibility, but how important is local news to having reliable elections?
Well, I think it's really important, because I think that one of the things that local news and local newspapers in particular, but not only, do is they give people in a community or city or region sort of a common base of facts, of common, you may feel differently about these facts and you may want to act differently, but you and your neighbor and the guy at the grocery store and the school teacher all sort of have seen the same verified information and understand it to be what's going on. As that fades away, we're sort of more drawn into the polarities of social media, each person with their echo chamber, or into the polarities of whatever national news we may, find ourselves watching, whether it's Fox or, MSNBC. And I'm not equating those two, but I'm just saying that they sort of represent different points of view. So I do think that the demise of local news is a problem. And I think what remains of local news, to put a more positive spin on it, what remains of local news, and the Inquirer remains strong, and my old paper in Buffalo remains strong, although they're smaller than they used to be, are extremely, extremely important. And we have to do everything we can in order to shore them up and save them, so that they can continue to do this vital job, including, by the way, the coronavirus reporting that has hurt them so much in terms of their revenue is also extremely important local reporting that we depend on. So there's a horrible, cruel paradox there. And when people say, well, what can I do? The first thing you can do is subscribe to your local, if you have a daily newspaper, subscribe. And if you have a nonprofit news organization that you trust, then contribute to it. And, open your wallet to support local news, because it's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I can agree more. And as far as the Inquirer, like the Buffalo News, the Inquirer has many fewer people than it did 10 or 20 years ago, and we've even had a handful of buyouts right in the middle of election season. And yet, at the same time, that we've treated the election as kind of an all hands on deck thing. And I have to say, and obviously I'm a biased source, but I think a lot of our election coverage has been really vital, and we've done things like videos explaining this whole naked ballot because people need very localized information that's Pennsylvania only information on how to vote in Pennsylvania, how to properly fill out your ballot and drop it off or mail it. Although I should be clear that it's too late to mail your ballot really at this point. If you have a mail-in ballot in Pennsylvania, you really need to drop it off at a drop box or your county election office. But that's the kind of information that we're trying to convey to people. And what's going to happen over the next 2 weeks in Pennsylvania is probably going to be very important for the whole nation. So if you want to know what's going on, the best place to do that here in Philadelphia is the Inquirer, and the only way to read all of our coverage is to subscribe. So hope folks will do that.
Yeah.
Do you guys think that Joe Biden is doing very well in the polls right now, and I think all of us agree nobody wants to get too swept up by that. We all remember what happened in 2016. I think people thought it was in the bag for Hillary Clinton, and it wasn't, right? So, but we are bombarded with these polls, and Joe Biden is doing pretty well in some of them, certainly the national ones and some of the battleground states. Does a big win for Joe Biden, does that really make it impossible for Trump to do some of the things that we've been talking about the last 40 minutes in terms of, how big of a win for Joe Biden really would be necessary for Trump to just have no chance of even credibly claiming a victory that he didn't get?
I have to say that I don't think that any amount of margin, any amount of dominance in the numbers is going to make much difference to Trump, because he makes up his own numbers, as we know from alternative facts, right? The inaugural crowd that was bigger than anything in the world, and the pandemic, the numbers we were rounding the corner. He's really not tethered to reality. So I'm not sure that, of course it would make a big difference if if it's a very, very strong Biden showing, and it would be much more favorable to him if it's close. But I don't even know that it would be a definitive.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in his own mind, nothing is going to convince him that he didn't win the election. Even if he lost by 12 points, he'll find some way to, explain that away. I do think though that for him to, for want of a better term, steal an election where he didn't get the most votes, he's ultimately going to need other people, right? I mean, he might need the Republicans in the Pennsylvania legislature. He might need them to sign off on different electors, or he might need, Homeland Security to call up troops for certain situations, or he might, he can't do it all by himself. And I think if his claims of victory are so implausible, I think he won't get. I think those people will abandon him. Some won't, but there's always going to be diehards. But I think at that point he's probably setting up his talking points for his career on OAN as a commentator in 2021, right? What he'll be claiming for the next 4 years. Of course, the nightmare thing that nobody likes to talk about is the way the Constitution works is if he loses this election, then he's legally eligible to run in 2024. So, right. So there's always that.
It can be in that landslide scenario that you. I think the safest thing. Just wanted to just make a. I haven't seen the latest models, but I think landslide scenario. If it can be called that night, I think it's different from what we anticipate to be. They're calling a blue wave, but that still is going to be with ballots still being counted. Many days after the election. And to your point, that's where the suppression comes in, because in a place like Pennsylvania where 40,000 plus some odd votes in 2016, so this is a game of margins, right? How many ballots get suppressed, when do you stop the count or something like that. So just wanted to to your point about the landslide.
Well, I guess we're going to know. I guess we're going to know in 4 days something. We're
going to know what we don't know.
We'll know a little bit more than we know right now, and maybe a lot more. So we've got a few minutes over. That's because we had so many great questions and you guys had so many great comments. So, but I'm gonna wrap things up now. So I just want to finish by again, saying, follow us at the Inquirer. If you're hitting that paywall, it's a good time to subscribe so you can follow our election coverage. You can follow me at the Will Bunch newsletter. You can Google it and sign up, and you'll get something from me every Tuesday. And obviously, we're going to be focused on the election in the next few weeks. In fact, I've got a special election one coming out next week. So sign up for that. And thanks everybody for joining this on Inquirer Live, the Will Bunch conversation. We certainly hope you enjoyed it. I know I enjoyed it. And on that note, on behalf of the Philadelphia Inquirer, I hope everybody has a wonderful day. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Thanks, Margaret. Thanks so much.